The bitter winds of the Danube frontier cut through the Roman camp like daggers of ice. It was the winter of 179 AD, and Marcus Aurelius, the last of the great philosopher-emperors, pulled his woolen cloak tighter as he emerged from his tent. At 58, his once strong frame had been weathered by years of constant warfare, but his eyes still held the keen intelligence that had made him both a revered ruler and a profound thinker. The Germanic tribes beyond the river had been restless for months. The Marcomanni Quae and their allies had tasted Roman blood during their earlier campaigns, and now they sensed weakness in the aging emperor. But Marcus Aurelius was far from weak. As he walked through the camp, soldiers bowed their heads in reverence. Here was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades defending the empire's northern borders, writing his philosophical meditations by candlelight between battles. Caesar, his aide Cassius, approached with urgent news. The barbarian chieftains have sent emissaries. They wish to discuss terms. Marcus nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasping behind his back. He had seen this before. The tribes would negotiate when cornered, only to break their agreements when they felt strong again. But this time felt different. His body was failing him, and he knew this might be his final campaign. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Marcus Aurelius prepared for what would become one of history's most significant diplomatic encounters. The Germanic chieftains arrived on horseback, their long hair braided with ornaments of bronze and silver. Their leader, a giant of a man named Valamar, dismounted with the confidence of someone who had never bowed to Rome. The negotiations took place in a hastily constructed pavilion between the two camps. Marcus Aurelius, despite his illness, presented himself with the dignity befitting a Roman emperor. He wore his purple-edged toga and the golden laurel crown, symbols of authority that had commanded respect across 3 continents for centuries. "You Romans grow old," Valamar declared through an interpreter, his voice carrying the arrogance of a warrior who had survived countless battles. "Your empire weakens. We have seen your legions bleed." Marcus Aurelius listened patiently, his fingers unconsciously tracing the leather binding of his personal journal, the very manuscript that would later be known as Meditations. The emperor's response was measured, philosophical yet firm. "Strength, chieftain, is not merely in the sword arm. It lies in the mind that guides the sword, in the principles that outlast the man who holds them." He gestured toward the Roman camp, where disciplined soldiers maintained their formations despite the bitter cold. "We are not merely conquerors. We are builders of civilization." What followed was a masterclass in diplomacy. Marcus Aurelius offered the Germanic tribes something unprecedented, not just peace, but partnership. He proposed settling them as foederati, allied troops who would defend Roman territory in exchange for land and citizenship. It was a radical departure from traditional Roman policy, born from his Stoic philosophy that saw all humanity as part of a greater cosmic order. The negotiations stretched for days. In the evenings, Marcus would return to his tent and write in his journal by oil lamp. His words from this period reveal a man wrestling with mortality while trying to secure his empire's future. "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. What we do now echoes in eternity." Meanwhile, his generals grew restless. Marcus Pompeianus, his most trusted commander, argued for a decisive military strike. "Caesar, we have them cornered. One swift campaign could end this threat forever." But Marcus Aurelius had seen too much blood. Too many promising young Romans die in the frozen mud of barbarian lands. His philosophical training told him that true victory came not from conquest, but from transforming enemies into allies. The breakthrough came when Marcus Aurelius made a personal gesture that stunned both Romans and Germans alike. During a particularly tense moment in the negotiations, when Valamar questioned Roman sincerity, the emperor removed his signet ring, the symbol of imperial authority, and placed it on the table. "This ring has been worn by Trajan, by Hadrian, by Antoninus Pius," he said quietly. "It represents not just power, but responsibility." the responsibility to rule justly, to protect the innocent, to build rather than destroy. He pushed the ring toward Valamar. If you doubt our word, hold this as surety, but know that when you return it to a friend, not an enemy. The Germanic chieftain stared at the ring, understanding the magnitude of the gesture. No Roman emperor had ever offered such a token of trust to a barbarian leader. Round the table, hardened warriors fell silent. In that moment, Marcus Aurelius had transformed a negotiation into something sacred. The treaty signed that winter would reshape the Roman frontier for generations. The Germanic tribes agreed to serve as buffer states, protecting Roman territory from more distant threats. In return, they received land grants, trading privileges, and the promise of Roman protection. Most importantly, they gained something they had never possessed: legitimacy in the eyes of the civilized world. But the cost to Marcus Aurelius was enormous. The stress of the campaign, combined with what historians now believe was plague, had ravaged his health. As spring approached, he knew his time was running short. He spent his final weeks writing letters to his son Commodus, trying to prepare him for the burdens of empire. "Remember that you are an actor in a play," he wrote to his heir, "which is as the author wants it to be. If short, then short; if long, then long. Play your part well, for the honor of the role, not for the applause of the crowd." On March 17, 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died in his tent on the Danube frontier. His last words, according to his aide Cassius, were, "Go to the rising sun, I am already setting." The greatest philosopher-emperor in Roman history had spent his final months not in the comfort of Rome, but in the mud and cold of a military camp, securing peace for future generations. The news of his death sent shockwaves through both the Roman and Germanic worlds. The barbarian chieftains, who had come to respect the emperor's wisdom and honor, declared a period of mourning. Valamar himself reportedly said, "Rome has lost not just an emperor but a teacher." The treaty Marcus Aurelius negotiated in his final campaign held for over a century, providing the Roman Empire with its longest period of peace on the northern frontier. The Germanic tribes, transformed from enemies into allies, became some of Rome's most loyal defenders. When later barbarian invasions threatened the empire, it was these same tribes who stood with Rome against the tide. Marcus Aurelius had achieved something that no amount of military victories could have accomplished. Through wisdom, diplomacy, and personal sacrifice, he had turned the tide of history. His meditations, written partly during this final campaign, would survive the fall of Rome itself, inspiring leaders and philosophers for 2 millennia. The philosopher-emperor's legacy reminds us that true leadership lies not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into friends. In the frozen wastes of the Danube frontier, Marcus Aurelius had written the final chapter of his reign not in blood, but in the ink of peace. The morning mist clung to the fields around Domremy like a burial shroud, and 13-year-old Joan of Arc could feel something momentous stirring in the air. It was the summer of 1425, and France was dying. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for nearly a century, with English armies controlling vast swaths of French territory. The rightful Dauphin, Charles VII, remained uncrowned, hiding in his court at Chinon while English forces tightened their grip on the kingdom. Joan was working in her father's garden when she first heard the voices. At first, she thought it was merely the wind rustling through the apple trees. But as she knelt among the vegetables, pulling weeds with hands already calloused from farm work, the sound became clearer. It was not the wind, but something far more profound, a voice that seemed to come from heaven itself. "Joan," the voice whispered, and the young girl's heart nearly stopped. She looked around frantically, but saw only the familiar landscape of her village, the stone church, the thatched cottages, the fields where she had played as a child. "Joan, daughter of God, you have work to do." The voice belonged to Saint Michael the Archangel, though Joan would not understand this until later. What she did understand, with a clarity that transcended her 13 years, was that she was being called to something extraordinary. The voice told her of France's suffering, of the English occupation, of the uncrowned king who needed her help. Over the following months, the voices came more frequently. Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine joined Saint Michael, providing Joan with detailed instructions about her divine mission. She was to travel to the court of the Dauphin, convince him to give her an army, and drive the English from French soil. For a peasant girl who had never traveled beyond her village, it seemed impossible. Joan's family noticed changes in her behavior. She became more devout, spending hours in prayer at the village church. Her mother, Isabel, worried about her daughter's increasing isolation. Joan spends too much time alone, she confided to her husband Jacques. She speaks of visions and voices. Perhaps we should take her to the priest. But Jacques d'Arc, a practical farmer, dismissed his wife's concerns. The girl is merely pious. In these dark times, we need more faith, not less. He could not have imagined that his daughter was receiving divine instructions to save France. The turning point came in May 1428, when Joan was 16. The voices had become more urgent, more specific. Saint Michael appeared to her in a vision so vivid that she could smell the celestial incense that surrounded him. The time has come, he told her. Orleans is under siege. The Dauphin wavers. France needs its savior. Joan knew she could delay no longer. She approached her uncle, Durand Laxart, with a request that must have seemed mad to the practical farmer. "Uncle, I must go to Vaucouleurs. I must speak with Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the garrison." Laxart stared at his niece in astonishment. Vaucouleurs was a fortified town, and Baudricourt was a hard man who had little patience for peasant girls with wild ideas. "Joan, child, what could you possibly want with such a man? I must convince him to give me an escort to Chinon," Joan replied with the calm certainty that had become her trademark. "I must speak with the Dauphin. God has commanded it." The first meeting with Robert de Baudricourt went as badly as could be expected. The grizzled captain, a veteran of numerous campaigns, looked at the teenage peasant girl standing before him and burst into laughter. "You want me to send you to the Dauphin? Child, go home to your father. Perhaps he can beat some sense into you." But Joan was not deterred. She returned to Domremy, but the voices gave her no peace. They told her of the deteriorating situation in Orleans, of the English tightening their siege, of French morale crumbling. "Return to Baudricourt," Saint Michael commanded. "Tell him that the Dauphin must be crowned at Reims before midsummer, or all will be lost." Joan's second visit to Vaucouleurs created a stir in the town. Word had spread about the peasant girl who claimed to speak with saints. Common soldiers, desperate for any hope in their seemingly hopeless war, began to gather around her. She spoke to them with an authority that seemed impossible for someone so young and humble. "God wills that the English be driven from France," she told them, her voice carrying across the garrison courtyard. "The Dauphin must be crowned king at Reims, as his ancestors were crowned. This is not my will, but the will of heaven." One young soldier, Jean de Metz, was so moved by her words that he knelt before her. "I will serve you, Joan, if you truly come from God." Soon, others joined him. Even some of Baudricourt's officers began to take notice. The captain himself remained skeptical until Joan made a prediction that chilled him to the bone. On February 12, she told him, "The French will suffer great defeat at Rouvray. The English will triumph, and many good men will die. Only after this disaster will you believe that God has sent me." Baudricourt dismissed her words, but on February 12, 1429, news arrived that French forces had indeed been defeated at the Battle of Rouvray, exactly as Joan had predicted. The captain stared at the messenger in shock, then immediately summoned the peasant girl. "How did you know?" he demanded. Joan's reply was simple. "My voices told me. They tell me many things about the war, about the king, about France's destiny. Will you now give me an escort to Chinon?" Faced with evidence of Joan's prophetic abilities, Baudricourt relented. He provided her with a small escort of 6 men, including Jean de Metz and another loyal follower, Bertrand de Poulengy. Joan was given men's clothing for the journey, a practical necessity for traveling through war-torn countryside, but symbolically important as well. She was transforming from a peasant girl into something unprecedented, a warrior maiden on a divine mission. The journey to Chinon was treacherous. English patrols controlled much of the territory, and hostile forces lurked in every forest. Joan's small party had to travel at night, avoiding main roads and sleeping in abandoned buildings. Yet throughout the 11-day journey, Joan never wavered in her confidence. "We will reach the Dauphin safely," she assured her nervous escorts. "God protects us. No harm will come to us on this mission." Her certainty proved justified. Despite numerous close calls with enemy patrols, the group reached Chinon safely, but gaining an audience with the Dauphin proved almost as difficult as the journey itself. The court was filled with advisors who viewed Joan's claims with suspicion. How could a peasant girl succeed where experienced generals had failed? The Dauphin, Charles VII, was a weak and indecisive man who had grown accustomed to disappointment. When told of Joan's arrival, he initially refused to see her. Another visionary, he muttered to his advisors, "France is full of them. They all claim to speak for God." But Joan would not be dismissed. She waited for 3 days in the antechamber, refusing to leave until granted an audience. Her persistence, combined with growing curiosity about her prophetic abilities, finally wore down the court's resistance. The meeting between Joan and the Dauphin has become legendary. Charles, skeptical of her claims, decided to test her. He dressed a courtier in royal robes and hid himself among the crowd of nobles, thinking to expose Joan as a fraud. But when Joan entered the great hall, she walked straight past the false king and knelt before Charles. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, "I am Joan the maid, sent by God to help you and your kingdom. I have been told by my voices that you shall be crowned at Reims, and that you shall be the true king of France." Charles was stunned. No one had told Joan what he looked like, yet she had recognized him immediately. But her next words shook him even more profoundly. In a voice that only he could hear, she repeated to him a private prayer he had made to God, asking for guidance about his royal legitimacy, a prayer he had never shared with another living soul. "How do you know these things?" he whispered. "My voices told me," Joan replied simply. "They tell me many things. They tell me that Orleans can be saved, that the English can be defeated, that France can be free, but only if you have faith." The court was divided about Joan's claims. Some advisors urged caution, pointing out that she was an untested peasant girl with no military experience. Others, led by the Queen Mother Yolande of Aragon, argued that desperate times called for desperate measures. France was losing the war. What harm could come from trying Joan's approach? Charles decided to test Joan further. He sent her to Poitiers, where a panel of theologians and scholars would examine her claims. For 3 weeks, learned doctors questioned her about her visions, her mission, and her understanding of theological matters. Joan answered their questions with a wisdom that amazed them. "You say you wish to have men at arms," one theologian challenged her. "But if God wishes to deliver France, he needs no soldiers." Joan's response became famous. "The soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory." The scholars could find no fault in her answers or her character. They concluded that while they could not prove her visions were divine, neither could they prove they were demonic. Given France's desperate situation, they recommended that the Dauphin give Joan a chance. Charles finally agreed to provide Joan with a small army and siege equipment to attempt the relief of Orleans. The city had been under English siege for 6 months, and its fall would open the road to southern France. If Joan could save Orleans, she might indeed be France's savior. Joan's transformation from peasant girl to military leader was remarkable. She donned a suit of white armor, specially made for her small frame, and carried a banner bearing the words Jesus Mary alongside images of God and the Archangel Michael. She cut her hair short and adopted the mannerisms of a knight, but never forgot her humble origins. The siege of Orleans became Joan's first great test. When she arrived at the city in April 1429, French morale was at its lowest point. The English had constructed a ring of fortifications around the city, slowly starving it into submission. French commanders had grown so demoralized that they were preparing to surrender. Joan's arrival changed everything. She rode through the streets of Orleans, her white armor gleaming in the torchlight, and the people poured out of their houses to see the maiden who had come to save them. "Take courage," she called out to them. "God has sent me to deliver you from the English. They will be driven from France." Her confidence was infectious. Soldiers who had been ready to lay down their arms took up weapons with renewed vigor. Citizens who had been preparing for surrender began to speak of victory. Joan had given them something they had almost forgotten: hope. The assault on the English fortifications began on May 4th. Joan led from the front, her banner flying as she urged the French soldiers forward. "Forward, friends," she cried. "God has given us the victory." Her courage inspired the men to feats of heroism they had not thought possible. During the assault on the Tourelles, the strongest English fortification, Joan was wounded by a crossbow bolt that pierced her shoulder. As she was carried from the field, French morale wavered, but Joan refused to retreat. She had the bolt removed, bound her wound, and returned to the battle. "The English are ours," she shouted, raising her banner high. "Forward, for God and France." The sight of their wounded leader returning to battle galvanized the French forces. They surged forward with irresistible force, overwhelming the English defenses. The siege of Orleans was lifted after just 4 days of fighting under Joan's leadership. The victory at Orleans transformed Joan from a curiosity into a national hero. News of the triumph spread throughout France, inspiring hope in regions that had known only defeat. But Joan knew this was only the beginning of her mission. "We must move quickly," she told the Dauphin. "The English are confused and demoralized. Now is the time to strike at their other strongholds. And you, gentle Dauphin, must prepare for your coronation at Reims." The Loire campaign that followed was a masterpiece of military strategy and inspiration. Joan led French forces in a series of swift victories that cleared the English from the Loire Valley. Town after town fell to her advancing army, often surrendering without a fight when they heard that the Maid of Orleans was approaching. At Jargeau, Joan personally led the assault on the walls, her courage inspiring the soldiers to superhuman efforts. At Patay, her tactical brilliance resulted in the most decisive French victory of the war, with over 2,000 English casualties against minimal French losses. But Joan's greatest triumph was yet to come. Throughout the campaign, she had insisted that the Dauphin must be crowned at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French royal coronations. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was finally crowned King of France, with Joan standing beside him in her white armor. "Gentle King," she said as the crown was placed on his head, "now is accomplished the pleasure of God, who willed that you should come to Reims to receive your worthy consecration, showing that you are the true king and the one to whom the kingdom of France belongs." The coronation at Reims was more than a ceremony. It was a declaration that France would never surrender to foreign occupation. Joan had accomplished the impossible. She had transformed a weak and indecisive Dauphin into a crowned king, and a defeated nation into a force capable of driving out its invaders. Joan's mission was essentially complete, but she did not know it. The voices that had guided her to this moment would soon fall silent, leaving her to face the cruel realities of medieval warfare without divine guidance. Her capture by Burgundian forces, her trial and execution by the English, lay ahead. But in the summer of 1429, standing in Reims Cathedral, as the new king received his crown, Joan of Arc had already changed the course of history. A peasant girl who had listened to voices from heaven had saved France, proving that faith, courage, and divine inspiration could triumph over any earthly power. The scream of the factory whistle pierced the cold Pittsburgh morning like a banshee's wail, and 13-year-old Andrew Carnegie knew that another day of backbreaking labor lay ahead. It was 1848, and the small Scottish immigrant had already tasted the bitter reality of American industrial life. His fingers, still soft from his childhood in Dunfermline, were now calloused from operating the spinning machines in Allegheny Cotton Mill, where he worked 12 hours a day for just $1.20 a week. The Carnegie family had arrived in America 3 years earlier, part of the great wave of Scottish immigrants fleeing economic hardship in their homeland. Andrew's father, William, had been a skilled handloom weaver, but the Industrial Revolution had destroyed his trade. Like thousands of other Scottish families, the Carnegies had mortgaged their future for passage to America, borrowing money they couldn't afford to repay for the promise of opportunity in the New World. But America's promise seemed hollow in the smoky, soot-covered streets of Allegheny. The family lived in a cramped two-room cellar apartment that they shared with another immigrant family. William Carnegie, once a proud craftsman, found himself reduced to peddling goods door to door, his spirit broken by the loss of his trade and status. It was Andrew's mother, Margaret, who became the family's driving force. "Andrew," she said one evening as they sat around their meager dinner table, "your father and I came to America not for ourselves, but for you and your brother Tom. We sacrificed everything so that you might have opportunities we never had. Don't waste them." Margaret Carnegie was a formidable woman, possessed of an iron will that would prove to be her son's greatest inheritance. She had watched her husband's decline with growing frustration, and was determined that her eldest son would not share his father's fate. In America, she told Andrew, a man can rise as high as his abilities, and determination will carry him, but he must be willing to work for it. Young Andrew absorbed his mother's lessons with the intensity of a sponge. Even as he labored in the cotton mill, he was constantly looking for ways to improve his position. He taught himself to read numbers and letters in the dim light of the factory, using whatever scraps of paper he could find. When he learned that messenger boys for the telegraph company earned more than factory workers, he immediately applied for the position. The Pittsburgh Telegraph Company was the nerve center of the city's growing industrial complex. In 1849, the telegraph was still a relatively new technology, and skilled operators were in high demand. Andrew's job was to deliver messages throughout the city, racing through the streets on foot with urgent communications for businessmen, government officials, and other important figures. The work was demanding, but it gave Andrew something he had never had before, a window into the world of business and finance. As he delivered messages to banks, steel mills, and railroad offices, he absorbed everything he could about how commerce worked. He memorized the names and faces of important businessmen, studied their habits and preferences, and slowly began to understand the complex web of relationships that drove the industrial economy. "The boy's got something special," observed David Brooks, the telegraph company's manager. "He's not just delivering messages, he's learning the business." Brooks was right. Andrew had discovered that knowledge was power, and he was determined to acquire as much of it as possible. Andrew's breakthrough came when he taught himself to interpret telegraph signals by sound alone. Most operators had to read the printed tape to understand messages, but Andrew developed the ability to transcribe Morse code directly from the clicking sounds of the telegraph key. This skill made him invaluable to the company and caught the attention of Thomas Scott, the Western Division superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott, a rising star in the railroad industry, was impressed by the young Scottish immigrant's intelligence and ambition. In 1853, he offered Andrew a position as his personal secretary and telegraph operator at the unprecedented salary of $35 per month, more than Andrew's entire family had been earning combined. "Mr. Scott," Andrew said when offered the position, "I won't disappoint you. I'll work harder than anyone else, and I'll learn everything there is to know about the railroad business. Scott smiled at the young man's earnestness. "I believe you will, Andrew. But remember, in business, it's not just about working hard. It's about working smart. Watch everything, learn everything, and always be ready to seize opportunities when they arise." The Pennsylvania Railroad was America's largest corporation, a sprawling empire of steel rails and steam engines that connected the East Coast to the growing markets of the Midwest. Working for Scott gave Andrew access to the highest levels of American business, and he made the most of every opportunity. He studied the railroad's operations with the intensity of a scholar, learning about scheduling, logistics, finance, and personnel management. He watched how Scott negotiated with suppliers, managed employees, and made the countless decisions that kept the vast railroad network functioning. Most importantly, he learned about the power of capital, how money could be invested to create more money, how debt could be used as a tool for expansion, and how the right investments could generate enormous returns. Andrew's first major test came in 1856, when a railroad bridge collapsed, blocking the main line between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Scott was away on business, leaving Andrew in charge of the Western Division. The young man, still only 21 years old, faced a crisis that could cost the company thousands of dollars for every hour of delay. Without hesitation, Andrew began issuing orders in Scott's name, rerouting trains, arranging for alternative transportation, and coordinating repair efforts. He worked for 36 hours straight, surviving on coffee and determination, until normal service was restored. When Scott returned, he found that Andrew had not only handled the crisis effectively but had actually improved the railroad's efficiency in the process. "You've got the makings of a great businessman," Scott told him. "But if you're going to succeed in America, you need to start thinking like a capitalist, not just a wage earner." Scott's advice led to Andrew's first investment opportunity. In 1856, Scott offered him a chance to buy 10 shares in the Adams Express Company for $600, money that Andrew didn't have. Margaret Carnegie, showing the same determination that had brought the family to America, mortgaged their small house to raise the funds. "This is our chance," she told her son. "We've sacrificed everything to get to this point. Now we must have the courage to risk everything to succeed." The investment proved to be Andrew's introduction to the world of high finance. Within months, he was receiving dividend checks that exceeded his monthly salary. For the first time in his life, he understood the difference between earning money through labor and earning money through ownership. It was a lesson that would shape everything he did for the rest of his life. As the 1850s drew to a close, Andrew's reputation in the railroad industry continued to grow. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to understand complex business problems and devise practical solutions. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed to replace aging wooden bridges with iron ones, Andrew identified the best suppliers and negotiated contracts that saved the company hundreds of thousands of rupees. When new routes needed to be planned, he studied maps and traffic patterns with the precision of a military strategist. But Andrew's greatest opportunity came with the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. The conflict created an enormous demand for transportation, as Union forces needed to move troops and supplies across vast distances. The Pennsylvania Railroad, with its extensive network and skilled management, was uniquely positioned to profit from the war. Scott was called to Washington to help organize the Union's transportation network, and he brought Andrew with him as his assistant. Working in the nation's capital during the war gave Andrew access to the highest levels of government and military leadership. He met President Lincoln, worked with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and helped coordinate the massive logistical effort that kept Union armies supplied. The war also introduced Andrew to the steel industry. As railroads expanded to meet wartime demands, the need for high-quality steel rails grew exponentially. Andrew watched as small iron foundries struggled to meet demand, and he began to envision a new kind of steel production, one that could produce high-quality steel in enormous quantities at relatively low cost. "The future belongs to steel," he told his brother Tom, "not just for railroads, but for everything. Buildings, bridges, ships, everything will be made of steel. The man who can produce the best steel most efficiently will become the richest man in America." After the war, Andrew made the decision that would define his career. He left the Pennsylvania Railroad to start his own company, focusing on the production of iron and steel. It was a risky move. He was giving up a secure, well-paying position to enter an industry dominated by established players. But Andrew had studied the market carefully and believed he could succeed through superior technology and business practices. His first major project was the construction of iron bridges to replace the wooden spans that had proven inadequate during the war. Andrew's bridges were not just stronger than their wooden predecessors, they were also more economical to build and maintain. His company, Keystone Bridge Works, quickly became the leading bridge builder in America. But Andrew's real breakthrough came when he learned about the Bessemer process, a revolutionary new method for producing steel that had been developed in England. The Bessemer process could produce high-quality steel much more quickly and cheaply than traditional methods, and Andrew immediately recognized its potential. "This will change everything," he told his partners. "We must build a Bessemer plant immediately, before our competitors realize what's happening." The construction of the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in 1873 marked the beginning of Andrew's transformation from successful businessman to industrial titan. The plant, located in Braddock, Pennsylvania, was the most advanced steel production facility in America. Using the Bessemer process, it could produce more steel in a day than traditional furnaces could produce in a week. Andrew's approach to steel production was revolutionary. While his competitors focused on maximizing short-term profits, he reinvested everything back into the business, constantly upgrading equipment and improving processes. He hired the best engineers and metallurgists, paying them top salaries to ensure that his plants remained at the cutting edge of technology. "The first man gets the oyster, the second man gets the shell," he was fond of saying. In business, being first with the best product is everything. The strategy paid off spectacularly. By 1880, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of its major competitors combined. The company's profits were so enormous that Andrew had become one of the richest men in America, with a personal fortune estimated at over $300 million, equivalent to billions in today's money. But Andrew's success came at a cost. The steel industry was notoriously dangerous, with workers facing constant risks from molten metal, heavy machinery, and toxic gases. Labor disputes were common, and Andrew found himself increasingly at odds with his workforce over wages and working conditions. The tension exploded in 1892 during the Homestead Strike, one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. When workers at Andrew's Homestead plant went on strike demanding better wages and working conditions, the company hired private security forces to break the strike. The confrontation resulted in several deaths and turned Andrew into a controversial figure. "I regret the violence," Andrew said in response to criticism, "but I cannot allow a small group of workers to dictate terms to the entire industry. We must maintain order and discipline if America is to remain competitive in the global marketplace." The Homestead Strike marked a turning point in Andrew's career. While he remained enormously wealthy and powerful, he was no longer seen as the scrappy immigrant who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Instead, he was viewed as a symbol of the harsh realities of industrial capitalism. Perhaps in response to this criticism, Andrew began to focus more on philanthropy. He had always believed that the wealthy had a responsibility to use their fortunes for the benefit of society, and he began to put this philosophy into practice on a massive scale. "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," he declared in his famous essay The Gospel of Wealth. It is the duty of the wealthy to use their fortunes to improve the condition of humanity. Andrew's philanthropic efforts were as systematic and ambitious as his business ventures. He funded the construction of over 2,500 libraries around the world, believing that education was the key to human progress. He established universities, supported scientific research, and funded peace organizations. By the time of his death in 1919, he had given away over $350 million, nearly his entire fortune. The Carnegie legacy extends far beyond his personal wealth. His innovations in steel production helped make possible the modern industrial economy, providing the materials needed for skyscrapers, automobiles, and countless other products. His business practices, particularly his focus on efficiency and continuous improvement, became standard throughout American industry. But perhaps Andrew's greatest contribution was his demonstration that in America, anyone could rise from humble beginnings to achieve extraordinary success. His life story embodied the American dream, the idea that hard work, intelligence, and determination could overcome any obstacle. From his childhood in a Scottish weaving village to his rise as the world's greatest steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie proved that America truly was a land of opportunity. His journey from telegraph boy to industrial titan inspired countless other immigrants and working-class Americans to pursue their own dreams of success. The small Scottish boy who had once worked 12-hour days in a cotton mill had transformed not just his own life, but the entire American economy. Andrew Carnegie's story remains one of the most remarkable tales of personal transformation in American history, proving that with determination, intelligence, and a willingness to take risks, even the humblest beginnings could lead to extraordinary achievements. These three extraordinary figures, Marcus Aurelius, Joan of Arc, and Andrew Carnegie, lived in different centuries, faced different challenges, and achieved different types of greatness. Yet their stories share common threads that reveal timeless truths about leadership, courage, and the human capacity for transformation. Marcus Aurelius showed us that true strength lies not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to understand when conquest is unnecessary. His final campaign on the Danube frontier demonstrated that the greatest victories are often won not through violence, but through the patient work of diplomacy and understanding. The philosopher emperor proved that power used wisely can transform enemies into allies and create peace that lasts for generations. Joan of Arc embodied the power of unwavering faith and determination. A peasant girl with no formal education or military training, she changed the course of history through sheer force of will and absolute belief in her divine mission. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most unlikely people can achieve the most extraordinary things, and that true leadership often comes from those who have nothing to lose and everything to give. Andrew Carnegie demonstrated the transformative power of the American dream. His journey from poverty to unprecedented wealth showed that in a land of opportunity, intelligence, and hard work could overcome any obstacle. But his story also revealed the responsibilities that come with great success, the obligation to use one's achievements for the betterment of humanity. Each of these leaders faced moments of profound choice that defined not just their own lives, but the trajectory of history itself. Marcus Aurelius chose diplomacy over warfare, creating lasting peace. Joan of Arc chose faith over fear, saving a nation. Andrew Carnegie chose innovation over tradition, building an industrial empire that transformed the modern world. Their legacies continue to inspire us today. Marcus Aurelius's meditations still guide leaders seeking wisdom in times of crisis. Joan of Arc remains a symbol of courage for those facing seemingly impossible odds. Carnegie's philanthropic example continues to influence how the wealthy view their responsibilities to society. What would you have done in their situations? Could you have shown Marcus Aurelius's restraint when your enemies seemed weak? Would you have had Joan's faith to pursue an impossible mission? Could you have matched Carnegie's determination to transform failure into unprecedented success? These questions matter because leadership opportunities exist in every era, in every profession, and in every community. The challenges we face today may be different from those confronted by a Roman emperor, a French peasant girl, or a Scottish immigrant, but the fundamental qualities of great leadership remain the same: wisdom, courage, and the determination to create something better than what came before. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, these historical examples remind us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they combine vision with action, principle with pragmatism, and personal ambition with service to others. The echoes of their achievements continue to resonate across time, inspiring new generations to write their own chapters in the ongoing story of human progress. What chapter will you write? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from history that continue to shape our world today. The past is not dead. It lives on in every choice we make and every challenge we overcome.